So I'm Rebecca Potts, a teaching artist currently based in Los Angeles. Right now I teach grades TK through 5th, plus a seniors class, age 55 plus. In the past I've taught middle school and high school. And now I am also the host of Teaching Artist Podcast, where I interview other amazing artists who teach young people. Now, I had the wonderful opportunity to do a lot of printmaking in grad school when I was getting my MFA about 10 years ago. I had access to giant presses and so much amazing equipment. My biggest challenge after graduating was figuring out how to continue printmaking at home without all of that stuff. And then as a teacher, figuring out how to adjust printmaking methods to work for my students in the classroom and now for my students at home without even as much as a brayer. So this tool feels super basic to me, but I know it's not a common tool for most households. Before we dive in, I have a few notes about this workshop. So I'm going to show you several different printmaking methods. I'll start each method by sharing some inspirational work by living artists with a focus on women and Black, Indigenous, Latinx artists of color. It is so important for our students that we are showing both windows and mirrors in the classroom when we share work that is inspirational. It's also really important that you provide context for that work. I will also dive into technique, including sharing common mistakes or pitfalls. You can, of course, pause the video whenever you need to, and I would love to have you actually create prints right here with me. So get a little bit of creative time for yourself. Now, I don't use all of these printmaking methods with all of my students each year, mostly just because I have really limited time with them. Right now, I teach each grade for only 10 weeks per year. That's 10 lessons. So I choose one printmaking method per grade and then scaffold year by year to build up those skills. If you do have more time and you can do an entire printmaking unit or weave printmaking in throughout the year, you can absolutely use more than one method per grade level. And I think that would actually give your students a much richer understanding of printmaking. So I will be covering these 7 methods. Now, some of them are very, very similar. So we're starting with stamping, which is what I like to start with my youngest students. It's sort of an introduction to printmaking. And actually, I also do texture rubbing. Rubbing is a really great introduction to the idea of printing as well. So I'm not demonstrating rubbing today, but I will show some stamping, and then I will get into monotypes, and we'll do 2 different types of monotype. One is with markers and one is with watercolors. So then we will get into Collagraph, and we'll do 2 different types of Collagraph. So with foil on top so that we can print using markers, and then without foil, which we will print using paint. So that one we're assuming they have some kind of paint. And then a Styrofoam relief print, which many of you might be familiar with, that we will print using markers. And finally, a dry point, so plastic dry point, which is a really exciting method of printmaking, a little bit more advanced. So that might be for older students. So let's get into it. I'm starting with stamping. This is a piece called Playground. This is by Stephanie Santana, who is a printmaker, but also paints and collages. So this is actually a painting and collage arranged on paper. But I thought this was really nice inspiration for a stamping unit or a stamping lesson. And so when I introduce an artist to students, I do my best with very limited time to carve out enough time that we can not only look at their work and discuss their work, but also discuss a little bit of context around their work. So I would show If I could find a video of the artist speaking, I would share that with my students, like a short clip of a video of her talking about her work. And I would share maybe just where she's from, and if there was anything important to the context of the actual work we were looking at, I would definitely share that. So Stephanie's work references family photographs and documents, layering hand-printed images and patterns as a way of understanding the space between memory, imagination, and the physical evidence of Black life. She believes in the possibility that textiles and print hold, as record keepers, as protection, as tactile objects of enduring personal and cultural significance. And she is based in Brooklyn, New York. And you can find her at stephaniesantana.com or on Instagram at stephmsantana. I'm going to be stamping using cardboard and washable markers. So if I want a circle stamp, I can use a toilet paper tube, craft tube, or I could use a paper towel tube. And I'm just going to color the side, and then I will get my paper a little bit wet. And I like to use a sponge. I just keep it in a little container. I make sure I squeeze out the water and then wipe my paper a few times just to get that paper a little bit wet. And then I can stamp my cardboard. And I can stamp it a bunch of times before I have to color it again. I'm also squeezing the cardboard to make an oval shape so I can change the shape with this tube. I could also squish it into a heart shape. I'm going to try stamping on a colored paper as well, because that's a fun effect that you can get. And see what patterns I can make. So I'm using a washable marker. And I'm noticing how I use the side of the marker. So that lets me more easily cover that little skinny edge of cardboard, using the side of the marker instead of trying to color it with the point of the marker. And when I've got that colored, then I need to get my paper wet again. So I'm going to take my sponge, wring it out so it's not dripping, and just wipe my paper. And with this paper, the construction paper, I might need to pat it instead of wiping it so much because this paper is a little bit more fragile. When I've got some wet parts, I can go ahead and start making my stamps. Making that pattern again. And I can keep going until I run out of ink. If I run out of ink on my cardboard, what do? I just color it again. And if you're noticing that some of the little spots are not printing that well, that could be that you're not pressing down in that area, or that you don't have enough color there, or it could just be a variation in the surface. So it might be that one side is a little bit further down, so it's not touching the paper on that spot. And that's okay, that's part of the printing process. So that will just make your prints a little more interesting. I can also use little sides like this to get that repetition. So I'm thinking about how the artist, how Stephanie Santana had repeated marks, so repeated lines and patterns in her artwork. So I could print this right on this wet spot, or I could wet a new part of my paper if I want to. So I'm just repeating that line all the way across, making kind of a pattern. Maybe I want that repeated pattern up here as well. and it's starting to run out. So I can go ahead and color it. And if I see a spot that didn't print quite right, I can try to go right back on top of it and redo that spot. Now this will also sometimes work on paper that's not even wet. Let's test that out. Ooh. So if you just drew your marker and it's still pretty wet on your cardboard, you can print like this without even getting your paper wet. It just means you have to reload your cardboard a little bit more often. So I can bend my cardboard however I want. I can try to make any shapes I want. That could be a fun challenge for students. Like, what shape can you make by bending your cardboard? So I can make kind of a V or even like a U shape. Maybe I like the idea of like a little rainbow. And then I can color that however I want. Maybe I'll use orange this time. Again, using the side of my marker. And let's see how that works without getting wet here. So I'm getting a nice U shape repeated there. I'm running out of ink though, so I'm going to color it again and keep going. Now, a few other things I like to use for stamping are Legos or any recycled materials, like lids are really good. So here's an old Lego. It still has a little paint on it. Let's see if the marker can work. So this one might need to be refreshed for every stamp you make. But it's giving me a really cool pattern. I love that with all the circles. So I can also, like I did before, if I really don't like the way one came out, I can try to line it up and print again. The trick with that is you usually are not going to get it perfectly lined up. So if you have one print underneath that did kind of work, you might end up with sort of two layered on top of each other that look kind of funny, that are just a little bit out of alignment. So I usually tell students that instead of putting it right on top and trying to print again, just try to print again on a new paper. But for a project like this where you're doing all this stamping, then I would say just embrace that mistake and it's okay. Even if it didn't quite turn out how you wanted, it's still going to look pretty cool. And that's just kind of part of this project. So I'm trying to use a lot of repetition, really repeating my patterns a lot. I start to run out of ink, so I add some more. And I like it when I can go all the way off the page like that. So it looks like that pattern just repeats forever and ever and ever. And I kind of like it there. I might crop my paper. I might trim that paper just a little bit to finish that right there. So that is stamping. And our next method is marker monotypes. We are looking at this artwork by Leslie Dogood. And this is titled Thunderclap. It is a 5-color screen print. Now, when I look at work with my students, I like to use the VTS method, Visual Thinking Strategies, and we ask through that method 3 questions. So you're facilitating the students really diving into the work and noticing
things about the work. So you would just look at it without giving a lot of background, and you would ask the students, what's happening here? What makes you say that? And what else can we find? So you facilitate a discussion about the work using those as your main prompting questions, and reframing if you need to, some of the things that students might say about the work. And so here is the artist, and again, if I could find video, I would share a video of her talking about her work with students. Today, I'm just sort of briefly sharing a little bit of information about each artist, and the artists whose work I'm sharing, I reached out to and have permission to share their work. There are a few artists that I will share a bio. I'll share some information about them and links where you can go look at their work, but I did not receive permission to share their work, so those artists I will not be sharing their actual work. Leslie Dogood is based in Brooklyn as well, just like Stephanie Santana. And she says people often take on the characteristics of what their last names imply. I come from a long line of education-obsessed, relentless self-starters, and the name Dogood comes from a phonetic spelling of her last name, Dogood. So she runs a press called Dogood Press. And she says, as a printmaker, the process of art making is what inspires me. I'm driven by the visual digestion of attractive qualities that happen when a piece is complete. Color is the gateway to our emotional language of experience that attracts viewers to interpret works of art and hopefully start conversations. So you can find her at dogoodpress.com or on Instagram at dogoodpress. For marker monotypes at home, I'm going to use either foil or plastic, and we are just going to draw on that foil or plastic using markers. So I'm drawing with my marker. Notice that I'm using the broad side of the marker. That helps me cover more area, but I can draw with the point and make some little details. I'm also noticing how the marker, it's repelled by the foil. You can see how there's kind of little beads of that marker ink, so it's not super smooth on there. It's going to give us some texture when we print it. And I can blend my colors using the markers. When I've colored my little printing plate, I'm going to move that out of the way and grab my paper, and then I need to get my paper wet. So just like I did at first with stamping, I need to get it wet. And this, unlike the stamping, this will not work without getting your paper a little bit wet. And then I can flip that printing plate right down onto my paper. Once it touches the paper, I don't want to move it around at all, and then I'm just using my hands to press it, give it a nice massage. I want to just be really careful to keep it still. So if it starts to fold, maybe you can't go in circles so much, you have to just go in one direction. And I'm being careful to hold it still with one hand while rubbing with the other hand. Now I'm using foil that's folded. It makes a little bit of a sturdier printing plate. I like how strong it is when it's folded, because sometimes the foil can actually tear if it's really thin. Ooh, so that was a beautiful result. Now that was printed on 80-pound sulfite paper. So I like to also show what it looks like if I use just regular copy paper, because that's what I'm assuming my students probably have at home. On copy paper, when you wet the copy paper, it is so thin that it's going to really soak in all that water, and you might not be able to kind of wipe the paper. Similar to the construction paper, actually. It's not as strong, so you may have to kind of blot it with the sponge in order for it to work. And with the copy paper, I like to put the paper on top of the printing plate. because that way the paper is so thin that I can actually see through to tell whether or not my marker is transferring. If it doesn't all transfer, if you can tell that there's a lot of white spaces, not all of the marker is coming off of your printing plate, you can actually re-wet it while it's still on the plate. So you can take your sponge and just dab it on top of that paper. Get it a little bit more wet. That water will soak that ink right off of the foil and onto your paper. And then you've got a beautiful print. Now, I really like working with plastic because it is see-through, which means I can kind of cheat and put a photo underneath. So I'm using just a large Ziploc bag, and I am putting a printout of a photo right underneath. And that's just from a black and white printer, so if your students do have a printer at home, they could use a printer and put a photo underneath, or they could even use a favorite book or a magazine, anything that they have that they would like to kind of trace that image. And just remembering that because this is a monotype using these markers, we're going to be getting it wet. The colors do tend to blur and blend a little bit. This is not the best method for something with lots of tiny little details. Whenever I'm done and I like how it looks, I can go ahead and grab my paper, and then I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to get that paper wet, and I'm using copy paper again so you can see how immediately the water really soaks through that paper. So I'm going to flip my plastic right down onto that paper. Sometimes when the paper's wet, it's very fragile, so it's hard to pick up and flip on top of the printing plate. So either way, you can have printing plate on top of paper or paper on top of printing plate, whichever way is easier for you for that particular moment. And that might change. Wow, and it all transferred. Amazing. Now let's do a watercolor monotype. So very similar to our marker monotype, just using watercolors. And let's look at some artwork. This is a piece called Erasmus and Anders, and this is by an artist named Chloe Alexander. This is polyester plate lithography, acrylic ink, and metallic pigment on Legion Stonehenge. So I noticed that she points out which paper she has used, which is common in printmaking. For this, I might lead a lesson about animals and their symbolism, or what does this mean? Do you notice how the hand is there kind of pulling the ribbon? So there could be a lot behind looking at this as an inspirational artwork. And again, I would share some context. So the artist is Chloe Alexander. She's based in Atlanta, Georgia. And her most recent work focuses on creating visual narratives by layering various printmaking techniques to create one-of-a-kind mixed media drawings. In addition to her personal art practice, Chloe works as a high school drawing and fashion illustration and design instructor. And you can view her work at thehaplessprintmaker.com or on Instagram at thehaplessprintmaker. For a watercolor monotype, it's going to be very similar to our marker monotypes. So I'm using the same method. I have my plastic bag, just cleaning it up a little. I have my bag. Now I could use foil, but I like this because with a plastic bag, I can put a photo underneath, so I can kind of trace a photo. And this is just, I chose an animal because I was thinking about how Chloe Alexander used those birds, those kind of crows in her artwork. And I know for her there's a lot of meaning behind them. So I was also thinking about, like, what's the meaning behind these owls and sort of their wisdom. So I was going to do 2 of them and then kind of connect them with some abstract imagery like the ribbons that Chloe had in her work. I'm going to start by kind of outlining their faces and also remembering that with this material, I'm not going to get a lot of little tiny details. And notice how the watercolor pools a little bit. That's normal. That's just how this works. It's a nice time to be able to talk about absorbency and how on paper the watercolor doesn't make those puddles so much because it absorbs into the paper. But here on the plastic is not at all absorbent. The plastic repels water. And just like with regular watercolor, I could take my time, be really patient, and let this dry, and then come back and add even more details into it. So I could wait and add my little spots of black in here, and that might work even better. So right now the black and the brown are just kind of blending into each other. Then I also need to be really careful, just like watercolor on paper. I don't want to touch whatever I make my background. I don't want to touch it to these little birds. When I'm done, I can let my painting dry on that plastic. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry, and then to print it, it will be exactly the same way again. So I will wet my paper with a sponge and then press this down on top. But first, I'm going to let it dry. It actually works better if you let it dry. So I would, if I was doing this with students, this would probably be a 2-day project where we paint the first day, set them on the drying rack carefully so they don't drip, and then come back, and the next time I see them, we take these totally dry plastic bags and print them onto paper. When I do it with students at home, I usually tell them, like, paint your painting, and then you can go take a break. Maybe you need to do other work, or you can go have lunch or take a walk if that's a safe thing for you to do. And then you can come back when this is dry and print. Okay, my little owls are just about all dry. So I can go ahead and get my paper wet. Same process again. I'm getting my sponge. I'm wringing it out so it's not dripping. And then I'm going to get my paper nice and wet. I want it to be pretty wet, and I'm wiping with the sponge so I don't get any of that sponge texture that I would get from blotting it with the sponge. And when it's pretty wet, I can go ahead and lay my plastic down, paint side down. And give it a nice press. So again, using my hand, holding it still with one hand and pressing with the other hand. Ooh, and some of those details are really coming through, which is kind of exciting. It depends on how much water you put down, so it's kind of a little bit of a tricky balance. If you don't put enough water, then your image won't transfer. But if you put too much, it's going to be really blurry. And I can see how it's already coming off of my plastic. I can start to peel it up and then also kind of press any areas that I want to transfer more. But that's pretty good. Ooh. So there's my little owl watercolor monotype. Now, if I wanted to, I could crop this. I can always trim down my paper. I can also wait till it dries and then paint back into it or draw back into it. So if I wanted to redraw some of this part that came out a little blurry, I want to add details to those birds, I could always do that coming back in. So this is a nice way to kind of do a first layer or get a background, and then you can always draw back into it or paint back into it. Now let's do a collagraph with foil. So we're going to print this using markers. And an artist that I would love to look at as inspiration for this is Crystal Worrell. She is based in Juneau, Alaska, and she is an Indigenous artist. You can view her work at crystalworrell.com or at Crystal Worrell on Instagram. And I did not have permission to share her work, so those are just some links I'm pointing you to if you would like to go see her work.
Another method of printmaking is called Collagraph, and that is really just a cardboard printing plate, and you can add any kind of textured material on top of a Collagraph plate. Now these can be printed either intaglio or relief. Of course, to print intaglio, you usually need a press. So with students at home, I usually print these relief, which means our goal is to get the paint or the ink on the surface of the plate and then take it off with the paper. So that's what goes on. With intaglio, you're rubbing the ink or the paint into all the little cracks, and your surfaces become kind of clear, kind of white, or whatever color your paper is, and all of the ink is kind of in those cracks. So it's almost the opposite idea with printing. And then you're pressing your paper really into those cracks to pull the ink out. So I print these relief, and these are made just with cardboard. So I start with a square. I like to use a square because then I can tile it really easily. So that's a fun way to talk about repetition, but variety within repetition. I start with my square, that's my base, and then I kind of sketch out an idea or a picture, and I start cutting out shapes for that picture. You can use, this is just cardboard with the top peeled off, so it gives that texture. You don't want to build up really high, so I did go up. You can see that these are raised up just a little bit, but I don't want it to be raised up a whole bunch because then the paint won't get on whatever's underneath it. So you want it all pretty much the same surface, the same level. So if I tip it here, it's all going to be like the same surface. Nothing's coming out further than the rest. You can also use string or even glue, like a thick line of glue, and let that dry. Bubble wrap is really fun for this. Textured wallpapers. There are so many options. You can mix sand into glue, and that gives you another texture. So lots of ways to make a collagraph. And this one is glued on and then sealed. And I sealed mine with a gloss acrylic medium. That is probably not something that everybody has at home. So I have tried lots of different ways of sealing these, and using glue doesn't work so well because when I put paint on here and pressed it onto the paper, it somehow, the paint or anything that got this wet sort of reactivated the glue and it would stick to the paper. So one thing that people might have at home, but this would require help from a parent, is like a gloss polyurethane, something they might have like in their hardware stuff. If they have a garage or something, they might have a gloss coat like that. Or you can, if you don't have any glossy thing to coat that cardboard with, you can use just the plain cardboard. You just won't get too many prints out of it because it will start to kind of fall apart. Another option is to cover your plate with foil. So my foil is just wrapped around this plate. It's nothing fancy. I didn't even tape it on, but let's peel it off and see what it looks like underneath there. So that's just my cardboard, and I used some rope on there that's glued down. And then I've pressed my foil into it. When I wrap my foil, this is one of the trickiest parts. So if I want to wrap my foil around my plate, I'm going to start by just putting it on top, and then I'm going to start on one side. So I'm going to choose a side to start on. Maybe I'll start over here, and I want to just gently run my finger along all of those dents, all of the textures that are in there. And my goal is to make the foil conform, make it into the same shapes that my cardboard was underneath that foil, while not breaking the foil. So I don't want to tear that poor foil. And as I do that, I want to also just wrap it around, just gently, really gently. And I have to really emphasize that with students because it is easy to rip or get like a little hole in the foil. And you're using the foil really just to seal your printing plate. And then our printing methods are going to be actually similar to what we've done before. So I've got these two options. I can, again, use my washable markers, or if I have some kind of paint, I can use a brush and paint that on. With the markers, I can really take my time. It's okay if the markers dry on here, because we are going to be using water on our paper, and that kind of reactivates the markers. Just like we saw with the Watercolor Monotype, I'm seeing how the markers kind of bead up on that foil. That's okay, don't worry about that. They will print just fine. And I'm getting my paper again. I'm going to use the same method that we have been using. So again, my sponge. And if I'm doing this in the classroom, I usually have a couple of trays of water, just a tiny bit of water with 2 sponges. So each pair of students shares that. Now, if you're in the classroom right now where you're not sharing supplies, that would mean you'd need like a sponge for each student. And I can press it down this way. I find that it works better if you have this under the plate underneath, and then you can really feel all of the shapes that you're pressing. And you can start to kind of see it on the paper, even with this thicker paper. So same method, I'm holding it still with one hand and pressing it really well with the other hand, going in circles, and then I'm going to trade. They're going to trade jobs. One hand is going to hold and the other is going to press, making sure I get every little corner, going around those shapes. And I can take a peek and just see how it's doing. Ooh, it looks like it's working pretty well. Can look at the other corner. Yeah, I think I'm ready. came out pretty nice. So I got some texture from the foil. That's totally normal. I got a little bit of blurring, but not bad at all. So one of the common mistakes that I see is a student will put a ton of water. So let's just try it out and see what happens. One mistake that I see actually is they'll print it and it doesn't come out right, and then they're like, I need to try it again. So they'll grab a new paper, get their paper wet, and put the plate down on it just like this. And it will not work because they just took all of the ink off of this. You have to re-ink your plate every time you print. So if I'm using markers, that means I have to color it again. I know it feels like a lot of work, right? Now I can color it different colors than what I did before, which is kind of cool. But sometimes a student will pick up their sponge and not wring it out at all. So the sponge is pretty heavy. It's really full of water. And then they kind of wring it out on their paper. So I've got like puddles of paper here. And I'm going to go ahead and print my plate this way, press it down. And oh my goodness. Oh, Mrs. Potts, my print didn't work. And I come over and see that there's puddles of water. So you have to make sure that first, when you use your sponge, you're squeezing it out so it's not full of water. It should not be dripping. It should not feel heavy. And then when you wipe it on your paper, you're wiping it maybe 3 or 4 times, just getting that paper a little bit wet. So it should not be dripping. Although this actually looks kind of cool. So that if you want to experiment with that, that's okay. So I encourage my students to figure out how to do it the right way, and then if they want to, they can do more experimental stuff like this. Another thing that sometimes happens is they don't put enough water. So I just do a couple of little swipes of water, and then I put my printing plate down and I try to print it, and it comes out really light or it's missing some details. And that is because I didn't have enough water. So here it's really kind of spotty. I didn't put enough water on there. So you really have to get the right balance of water for this to work. So another way to print is with paint.
So we're going to seal our Collagraph using a gel medium and then use paint to print it. And there is an option to not seal the Collagraph, but that means it will not last as long. And an inspirational artist that I would like to look at for this is Beatriz Milhazes, who's an artist from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And she makes these very colorful paintings with lots of shapes and lines. And again, I am pointing you towards her gallery. So she is shown at James Cohen Gallery. So if you go to the link that's here on the screen, you can find her work or follow her on Instagram at Beatriz Milhazes.
When I'm working at home, I'm assuming my students aren't going to have actual printmaking ink. So one thing I've been using is like finger paint. This is finger paint that I had for my daughter, but a lot of families might have finger paint or sort of a basic paint like this. So this is something that can work if I can get it out of the bottle. For students that are working at home, I use brushes. So any kind of brush is fine. This is like almost like a hardware store type of brush. And I would just brush the paint on. You're going to get some of those little brush marks showing up, but that's okay. No big deal. It kind of adds some nice texture. When it's all covered, then I can go ahead and I'm going to set this down and press my paper right on top. And same method, holding it still with one hand, pressing it, give that paper a really nice massage. It's had such a long day. And then because this is sealed, I can go wash it off in the sink, which is really nice. If it was just the cardboard, I might actually just let it dry on there or kind of gently wipe it off with like a wet wipe and then let that cardboard dry. The more water the cardboard comes into contact with, the sooner it's going to kind of break down.
And let's do Styrofoam relief prints. So this is probably something that you may have done in the classroom before. And I like to print these using markers at home. And an artist that could be inspiration for a lesson using Styrofoam relief prints is Star Hardridge. He is based in central Oklahoma and is an indigenous artist. And he makes work that is kind of like pointillism. He uses lots of dots, but it's also very sort of bright and colorful with strong geometry. And you can view his work at his website, starhardridge.com, or on Instagram at starhardridge.
So one method that many of you have maybe already done in the classroom is using these Styrofoam printing plates. So these are great with younger students. You can get a pack of like 100 of these for $10 on Amazon. So this is really affordable and could be something that you maybe include in a kit to send home. But if you don't do that, or if students don't have this at home, you can also use Styrofoam plates. And I usually just cut off the edges so it's not like raised up. So I'm just getting the flat part of the plate. Or sometimes cheese or deli meat is sold on Styrofoam trays. If you wash those really well, you can use those. So any kind of Styrofoam will work for this. To use our Styrofoam trays, you can use them the same way you would use foil or plastic. You can just draw right on there with markers or with paint. But the cool thing about Styrofoam is that you can really easily dent it. So I've drawn a little image here that's dented in with pen. And the way that I usually work with students with Styrofoam is I'll offer them pieces of paper that are cut to the same size as the Styrofoam and ask them to sketch out their idea first, because there's no erasing on this. Once you dent it, it's dented. You can't go back. So if I had my little piece of paper, so I've got that paper that fits exactly on that Styrofoam, I can draw whatever picture I want. I can take my time, so I can use my pencil and draw out whatever it is I want to draw. I'm just going to do another kind of landscape, but this means students could take their time and draw like much more detailed pictures. And when I feel like I love that picture, I'm ready to make it into a printing plate. What I have students do is put their paper, so we're going to trace this, but we're tracing it not the way you usually think of tracing. So usually when I say trace, you think, okay, I'm going to put this thing on top. Oh, but wait, I can't see it. And even if I put it up to the light, I can't see through the Styrofoam. So this goes on top, and we usually actually tape this down. And I like to tape right to the table, because sometimes if you tape it on the Styrofoam, it kind of damages the Styrofoam a little bit when you try to take it off. So I tape the drawing over the Styrofoam just like that. And when I'm teaching in the classroom, I usually have pre-cut a whole bunch of little bits of tape, so I can just walk around handing that out, or I even sometimes leave that on the table because I teach elementary and my students usually have trouble tearing the tape for themselves. So you've got that, then you're just going to trace over it. And for this part, I actually like to use a pen because I can press down without breaking my pencil lead. And I press down pretty hard, but not hard enough that I'm going to poke through that styrofoam. So the rule of thumb that I tell students is you want to be able to feel that dent. I just moved my thing. So if you've traced all of your lines and you peek under there and you can see that line, as long as you can see that line, you're ready to lift up your paper. So I can see my lines. I'm going to take this out or take this paper off. And I can see it when I run my finger over it. I kind of feel the dents, but not very well. So that means I probably need to trace it one more time. So I'm going to go, now that I can see where my lines are, I'm just going to go right back over those lines. And I'm not worried about the ink from my pen getting in there. And if I decide while I'm doing this that I actually wanted to add something else, that's fine. I don't have to stick with what I had drawn on my paper. I can change it. So if I'm kind of happy with that, then I'm ready to print. And our printing is going to be very similar to what we've done before. So I can, if I'm in the classroom, I can use a brayer and roll ink onto this. Or at home, I can use my washable markers, my handy washable markers again. I usually show students how when I'm coloring with my markers, I turn the marker kind of sideways, so I'm using the fat part of the marker, the wide part of the marker. And I'm not trying to put my little tip of my marker into those lines. Those lines are actually going to end up white or whatever color my paper is. So I want to color over the lines, not in the lines. And I want to go all the way to the edge of my printing plate. Now I noticed that my cloud has some little lines in it. Are those going to show up if I just leave it white? No. So that's one mistake that I see students make sometimes. They draw all these little details in an area, and then they print and they get so frustrated that those details didn't show up because they didn't color over them. So if you don't color it, there's nothing there to go onto your paper. So it cannot print if you don't add any color. So I'm trying not to touch the front of the styrofoam, because what happens if I touch it? Well, yeah, I'm going to get markers on my fingers, but what's going to happen to my print? It's going to end up with fingerprints, because anywhere where I have touched it, the marker, the ink is no longer on here. Now it's on my finger, so it's going to show a white fingerprint when I print it. So now that's colored. And then I've got my paper. I'm going to do the same thing that I've done before. Ooh, I like how that came out. So yeah, up at the top here, when you get that kind of speckly texture, that means you either didn't press enough there or you didn't have enough water on your paper. So that's normal, that happens, and it is okay. You can always make another print, or sometimes students like to go back and draw with markers there. Another thing I notice here is that my trees are showing up as white because they are where I had drawn, I dented in where those trees are. So anything that's dented is going to be white. But if I wanted those to be like dark green pine trees or something, that's another place where I could go back in and draw. I want to let my paper dry, and then I can go draw on top of this. Another really fun thing to do with the Styrofoam printing plates is to get super detailed. So you can make, this is a square, so this is great for tiling. You can make all kinds of patterns and details using this Styrofoam. And with this one, I could spend a lot of time coloring like each little area a different color. Right now I'm just going to do it all kind of one color just so we can see what this plate looks like. I'm coloring gently. I don't want to dent my Styrofoam plate while I color. So that one's all colored. We're going to do the same thing we did before, and I'm just using this same paper. And I can peel it up. Isn't that amazing? I love all the different patterns that makes. So this is a really fun way, like I could imagine tiling that image, and you can, when you have a square like that, you can also twist it so it can change a little bit each time.
And one final method is plastic dry point. This is a way to do it using thinner plastic, and I've even seen this work on milk jugs. So I had this plastic from some kind of crafting kit for my daughter, but you could do it as well on milk jugs. So that might be something more accessible to more students. And an artist that I would love to look at for this is LaToya Hobbs. She is based in Baltimore, Maryland. And she deals with figurative imagery that addresses the ideas of beauty and cultural identity while re-examining the traditional triadic artist-model-viewer relationship. And you can view her work at latoyamhobbs.com or on Instagram at latoyahobbs. This is kind of a precursor to etching, where you carve into metal. And with etching, you're covering your metal plate with a ground and then scraping that off and using acid to etch the plate. So that's a process you could talk about with students so they know kind of the history, the background of what we're doing. But now I'm using a thin plastic. It's a little thicker than a plastic bag. And this is just a piece of plastic that came with like a craft kit my daughter had. But you could use milk jugs. I've seen the plastic from milk jugs used for this, and that actually worked pretty well. So what I'm doing, I tried to think about what tools students might have at home that could sort of carve or scratch the plastic, and I'm just using a pen. So I'm hoping that this pen will be enough to make a mark, and a mark that will show up when we print. So I've been just carving, and I've got a lot of it done. I'm just going to keep going, and I'm doing this just by pressing down pretty hard with my pen. And the first thing I did is I actually traced a photo using a Sharpie. So now I'm just going back over that Sharpie line. So I love using clear plastic for these processes because it lets you trace a photo, which makes it so much easier. And that also, for students, that kind of gets rid of this fear of, oh, but I can't draw. It's like, well, you don't really have to draw. You just have to be able to trace and see an interesting image. And this is definitely one for older students. It's pretty tricky, pretty hard to press down hard enough to make this work. So for this, it does really help to have actual printmaking ink. So I'm going to just wipe a little bit of ink on there. The goal with this, we are actually going to do intaglio printing at home without a press. So our goal is to press that, to push that ink into all of the lines. I'm going to use a paper towel and just rub it in, trying to push it into any of the lines that I've made. And get a little more ink, and I'm putting it directly on my printmaking plate. So for this method, really the only special tool that you need is the actual ink. And now the part of intaglio printmaking that's kind of fun, but also a little bit time consuming, is now I need to rub it off the surface without taking it out of the lines. So I'm going to use my paper towel and make kind of a flat surface. And I'm going to use that to gently just rub my ink all over, trying to get it off the surface while leaving it in the lines. And I'm making sure to go all the way to the edges of the plate. So this is giving me what's called plate tone. And now while I'm doing this, I could have some paper soaking, getting ready for me, because this will require your paper to be even more kind of damp. So I could still clean it up a bit more, but I'm going to go ahead and try printing and just see how this turns out, see what it looks like. So to print, I soaked my paper, so it's damp paper, and then I'm going to set this down, and my paper goes right on top. And in order to print with no press, I need to really get into those lines. I'm going to use a piece of paper on top to help protect this paper. And I'm actually going to use a spoon to press it. That's a little stronger than my hands. I'm still using one hand to hold it still and make sure it doesn't move around at all. But then I'm just going over the whole thing with my spoon. Yeah, so I noticed that I don't see the image that well here. It's just there's too much ink still left on there. So I could have done a better job when I was inking my plate of getting the ink off, not leaving so much ink on the surface, trying to really take my time with wiping so that I didn't have so much ink still on the surface, kind of obscuring my image. But a pretty good first print. The other thing to know about printmaking is that when you're using a plate like this, a plate that you're going to pull multiple times, so not a monoprint, usually the first one is a little lighter and not as detailed. It takes a little bit of time to build up the ink on your surface. So the second one would probably turn out better, and we could keep going.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, or even later on, if you run into any issues or feel like you need some help, you can always reach out to me. My email is rebeccapotts@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram @PottsArt and @Teaching Artist Podcast. And there you can listen along to inspiring conversations with other artists who teach, kind of juggling making art and teaching art. And that can be found wherever you listen to your podcasts. So thank you so much for listening and for watching. I really hope that this gives you some ideas for incorporating printmaking with your students even while they are at home, or if you're in a classroom with a super limited budget.